모스트 포던 팟캐스트.
Okay, welcome everybody back to Most Modern. Today we're joined by William Shivers, who is a landscape architect, a PhD candidate, and a lecturer in landscape architecture at the University of Virginia. William has previously taught at Auburn University and is currently researching the expansion, creation, and maintenance of the American landscape from the outside in. Where do you join us from today, William?
I am in Charlottesville, Virginia, at the University of Virginia in some random room in some random building.
Well, thank you for joining us from the place of randomness. But I think what's really fascinating for us is you're our first landscape architect to join the show. So maybe we can just start off with yourself, how you got into landscape architecture and how you landed where you are these days.
That's a great question. In many ways, I'm kind of an odd case. I went into undergrad wanting to study landscape architecture, which is not the typical convention. I was someone who was always fascinated with architecture. I was a Lego-minded kid. I loved building cities and buildings and things, but I'm really bad in math. And so architecture majors weren't the path for me. But I always really liked being in nature. I loved going to the zoo when I was a kid. I loved going to being out in the country in Texas where I'm from and being outside in that. I always really liked. And so I remember kind of trying to find what is a balance between architecture and nature. And it popped up with landscape architecture. And then I found that. And so I went to LSU for undergrad and I got a bachelor's of landscape architecture. That's my professional degree. Did that for 5 years. And then I went to the GSD for my post-professional master's of landscape architecture. I practiced for a bit, and then I came back into the academy to pursue my PhD. And the constructed environment is what we call it here at UVA, but I really focus on landscape architecture still. And so in many ways, I am 100% a landscape architect in what I do.
That's great. Can you explain to us what the education process is like in landscape? Is it mostly design focused, or do you have to deal with, I guess, science, ecology?
Most programs, because if you're getting your professional degree, there's standardization across the board, and so it's a studio-based program, which is typical to architecture. Some planning programs are studio-based, but we are required to take our construction classes, but there's plant material that we have to learn, and so figuring out how plants work, how plants grow, how to design with living material is something that I think we specialize in a little bit more than architecture. Because things rot, things decompose, things can get reborn and regrow, and we have to learn how to work with that. So I think that's kind of the little bit of a difference in landscape education and landscape pedagogy, but there's a lot of overlap, I think, with architectural education as well.
What do you consider good landscape architecture?
That's a great question. I consider good landscape architecture as being sound between the needs and desires of humans, non-humans, and kind of larger environmental systems.
Can you take us through what a professional landscape architect does? How do you work with architects? What projects do you engage in? What is that process like?
So there's a range in how we work as landscape architects. And I mean, we could talk forever about how we work. I would say kind of the big ones that are typically considered is that we are a subconsultant to an architect or an architecture firm. And we're brought in sometimes at the beginning of a project, oftentimes a little bit later. We're given the remainder of a budget, and then we have to make the building somehow integrate into its environment or into the site in which it exists. Other times, there's many projects that our profession does that we are the prime, and that we are given, a city park or a streetscape or even a forest, kind of a larger kind of national park scale as well. And then we lead that with our own subconsultants as well. Those are, I think, the two big ones. And then there's also a lot of work that's actually done in the academy. There's a lot of grants that have been given out to landscape architects in the academy to do kind of speculative design research. And that is then kind of catalyzing a new series of projects that are coming online, particularly in the United States.
So in terms of different scales, what types of ranges would a landscape architect work on?
That can go anywhere between a flower pot that sits in front of your, front door. We design those for, aesthetic qualities. We scale, I think the typical convention that people associate landscape architects with is a backyard. Oftentimes we're always approached by someone, can you design my backyard? Can you help my backyard? Or I gotta, do something with these, hydrangeas. And it's like, okay, well, we do more than that. But I think what's becoming more typical that we do is city parks, streetscapes. There's been a lot of work in the United States on major civic investment in public park amenities. A lot of cities, especially post-COVID, have wanted to reinvest in the public realm because there's been a lot of population shifts with remote work and people wanting to move for whatever reason. And so there's been significant investment outside of major cities like New York or San Francisco or Houston, where other cities are kind of recreating their major kind of their version of a central park or their version of their kind of iconic public space that becomes the city's identity.
That's interesting. I mean, when you think of the most iconic public spaces in America, Central Park, for instance, or a lot of the work that Olmsted did around the Northeast, we think of these grand places. Is that still something that landscape architects do, or has it changed in the past few generations?
That's a great question. I think we still do a lot of iconography, frankly. I think we do a lot of just creating identity through the landscape, especially for urban environments. We do a lot of work in national parks as well. So we also do a lot of work in creating our national identity. Or I would argue, I think we create our national identity. But I think we've actually gotten a lot of grit lately. Landscape architecture has gotten kind of messy and industrial, dealing with the post-industrial. Kadorf and Scape has done, the oyster projects in New York. That's not the most aesthetically pleasing, but environmentally, it's doing a huge amount of work. The work of Brian Davis here at the University of Virginia has done a lot of work on breakwater design, and there's been a lot of work in dealing with just how do we move sediment around. It's mud, it's silt. It's not anything that's aesthetically pleasing. And so I think we've approached a moment, I think, in our profession where we're kind of in our boots and our waders, and we're just kind of like in the gunk, and we're trying to deal with how do we deal with health, safety, and welfare. And that takes on a different approach than what maybe a typical architect does.
I want to go back to a little bit of what you said about like creating iconography through landscape. I think through our design education, like iconic architecture, iconic buildings was a huge part of it. But like, how does that work for a park? Like, how do you create iconography through landscape?
It's similar to architecture, but different. So I would argue, at least in the United States, we borrow a lot from artistic movements, Romanticism, the pastoral, even the sublime. And the American landscape actually expanded a lot in the 19th century. I mean, we literally moved westward. And we were a we were a kind of monetarily poor country, but we were resource rich. And so what we could do is give this promise of like limitless expansion and extraction and cultivation in the landscape to create an identity. And so for us as Americans and in the United States, our natural identity is our national identity. You can open up a passport and you'll see mountain ranges and buffalo and bald eagles and all this other stuff. And it's nature-based iconography. Like Rome and Italy has more architectural kind of legacies of ancient civilizations. That can also stretch to kind of China and Tiananmen Square and the Forbidden City. And, there's architectural precedent for that. But for the United States, a lot of it is actually matched with amber waves of grain and all these kind of romantic associations with nature.
Yeah, it is so funny to land in JFK or San Francisco International and you're met with like buffalo and the Sierra Nevadas and that iconography on the, while you're taking out your passport. It's just, it's the stuff that you read about as a kid, sort of the wild, wild west. But it is true that, and now that you think about it, I guess modern America is almost one large landscape architecture project. How do you
very much so
control the land and turn it into, in a lot of cases, an economic engine? Is that something that you deal with?
100%. I think so. Our work is all of our work has boundaries. Our projects have boundaries. There are legal limits to what we're allowed to do. There's contractual limits to what we're allowed to do. But it's all about what are we touching? What are we contributing to? For landscape architecture, we're not typically enclosed like an architectural envelope that might happen. And so we have inputs and outputs that are radically different than architecture. And so we have to really consider a lot of different scales. And some of those scales could be like the scale of an entire current of water, or how the monarch butterfly population might pass over this. And so we have to kind of consider those types of inputs and outputs in dealing with our project boundaries and how we design for those things.
Just curious, what's your take on the vertical garden project of Stefano Boeri in Milan?
Stefano Boeri, I've seen a lot of his work. I've directly critiqued some of his work. I think it's interesting in concept. I think it's actually poor in execution. I think cloaking a building in vegetation is a noble pursuit, but there's a lot of mechanics that are forced on that. You have to irrigate something completely vertical. That takes a lot of infrastructure. The soil itself is not necessarily reproducing itself, so there's a lot of fertilizer, there's a lot of synthetic maintenance that you have to do. And due to the climate in Milan, there's also a lot of particulate that also happens. And so those who are living there, there's what they've noticed, there's a lot of broom sweeping of dust and kind of other kind of material that they're having to maintain that wasn't exactly foreseen in the original drawings and perspectives from Boeri.
Yeah, I mean, just to expand the conversation a little bit to how a lot of times landscape is applied to the physical environment these days, I think there's a lot of people, including architects, but also common folk, non-designers, who think that landscape elements can be used as architectural elements. So as Minku was talking about, making a green wall or putting trees up in the sky. But it seems like, William, as someone who deals with this every day, that there are a lot of limitations to actually dealing with living elements like that in the form, but treating them as architectural elements. What other things should one consider when thinking about applying trees, planting, that sort of thing to the built environment?
Well, I think it's, there's a longevity to it. There's a lifespan. The average street tree lives only 7 years.
Wow.
We use and abuse street trees, especially in snowy climates, because they have to, salt, and there's de-icing agents and stuff like that. And they're also growing in compacted containers. But on top of that, nature doesn't want to be controlled. And that's one of the hardest things that we have to negotiate with. We as designers are trying to design or control something. We're trying to facilitate something. And nature typically doesn't like that. Sometimes it does, there's kind of manicured or kind of the maintenance regimes of keeping something up. But oftentimes it's, nature's always going to resist our work. No matter what, nature's going to resist it in some capacity. There's different applications of that. I think that's one of the hardest things we have to deal with is the power of nature.
But how do you decide when to work with nature and when to work against it?
Well, I would say systems based. So you can work with gravity and you can work with nature in terms of directing stormwater management. You can work with nature in terms of how certain plants might be able to filter out heavy metals or chemicals from runoff in a storm drain. You can also design with plant material to tackle heat or to tackle shade. And so I think there's ways that are, what's ever in the RFP or whatever's, asked for from the client, there's always something that's not working. There's always something that's not quite right. And that I would say is separate from aesthetics. Every client typically wants this to be aesthetically pleasing space. But we have to kind of deal with some type of environmental problem or some type of solution. And then we have to design for that. And we can get nature to do that for us. Nature likes working. But there's also an element of resisting that as well. Nature never has a day off.
I guess when you're working within these systems, especially say you have like a urban boundary where you only have control over such a finite space, but there's so many inputs and outputs, like what's the research process like? What goes in and out of this small plot?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're in an urban environment, typically we have to, I think the first kind of place of research that starts is figuring out what is the greater ecoregion we're in? What's the biome we're working in? Are we in the desert? Are we in a coastal area? Are we in, a 4-season space, or are we in the tropics? We got to start there to figure out, what is the seasonal or kind of the larger volatility of the space. And volatility not necessarily meaning danger, but just how does this work? And then when we understand the larger processes at play, then it's a matter of kind of whittling down. What grows here? What plants are meant to be here? And then we're typically kind of matched with what's going to be growing here in the future in, a wetter world or a hotter world or a drier area. And then there's also the legality of it. And so some species are not allowed to be planted. A lot of cities have their list of approved trees or approved species that we can use. And so sometimes it's a matter of also advocacy and bringing back native species, trying to use what is appropriate for working here, what's existed here for millennia. But for whatever reason, sometimes a few bureaucratic moves don't let that happen.
Is there any aesthetical angle there too?
Of course.
Like, is there a stylistic approach too in there?
Of course. And so, we deal with color, we deal with texture, we deal with, microclimate, we deal with a lot of just like, how does this look? And you want to be in a space that feels good at the end of the day. And there's an array of amazing plant-based kind of experts. And I would say the most notable is Roberto Burle Marx, who was kind of a Brazilian jack of all trades. He was an artist, he was a painter, he was a landscape architect. He subverted the fascist government by being a landscape architect. But he's credited with going on these interior trips into the interior of Brazil, finding the plants that grow and work, and then bringing them back into the major cities like Rio or Sao Paulo, and then getting the people to actually like agree that this is aesthetically pleasing. And so I think he's one of the strongest examples in that. He has kind of scions. Raymond Jungles in Miami is one of them. And then there's a lot more as well.
Well, Burle Marx is an interesting figure because, at least for me, my most sort of favorite work of his is the paving along Ipanema or Copacabana in Rio, which we often think of landscape as being a soft medium: trees, plants, soils. But there's increasingly more and more work that's done through hardscape, through urban plazas, through sidewalks, through roads. How has that conversation shifted the sort of direction of the profession?
That's a good question. I think hardscape is something that is often overlooked, but we're, I think, getting better at doing. Impervious paving, whether it's asphalt, stone, pavers, etc. I think that is always kind of a like, we have to get that done. Okay, yeah, we need to have parking. We need to, get that done. But I think we're taking better solutions at it. And I think Roberto Burle Marx did a really good job at this major beachfront project. And again, creating an aesthetic and kind of geometrical design that people relate to. It created space that negotiated between the beach and the road system that's there, but it created the public middle ground and kind of the interchange between this urban environment of Rio and the natural environment of Rio that is literally being framed by what he does.
It's interesting because I'm almost running out of the names that I know of landscape architects. We talked about Olmsted, we talked about Burle Marx. There's one more that I know that I'm very curious to hear your take on him. What about Pierre Oudolphe?
Pierre Oudolphe, I would say he's the other planting expert, 100%. I know there's more, but Pierre, I think, what he has really done is created a new type of planting design that is incredibly thought out, and his drawings are incredible when you look at them. But he has really understood, like at Lurie Garden in Chicago, really understood of using plants that have existed there and using native plants, but effectively really well to create living art where it's texture, it's seasonal, to where it might be in full bloom in the summer or the spring or summer, and it's all these different colors. But in the winter, it's dormant, and you get to see the texture that comes forward in these range of browns or grays or even whites that might exist. And I think he does a really good job negotiating that. His projects are sometimes a little bit more framed in. Literally, Lurie Garden, it is framed in. But a lot of his work back in Europe is, some of it's corporate, some of it's kind of park space. But I think I would consider more of an artist, like a plant-based artist than a landscape architect, even though he is one.
Yeah, it really looked like his photos look like some impressionist paintings.
They are.
Like it was incredibly beautiful.
Yeah, it's like a Monet. It's like a Monet painting come to life.
Yeah, are those approaches still consistent with contemporary practices that you see either in Europe or in America?
I think world over, Piet is definitely one who is really well respected and studied. But I think there's more attention in the United States on the post-industrial. So Kate Orff is one who's done a lot in kind of thinking about the post-industrial plant palette and kind of towards a new urban ecology, I believe is one of her books. Jill DeSimone is another one who's understood kind of the post-industrial planting design.
Sorry, I have a dumb question. What does that mean? What is a post-industrial planting palette?
Well, that's a really good question. So y'all build industrial buildings. Architects build the factories. And then whatever factory is doing that usually dumps a whole bunch of stuff that's not the cleanest material. And it sinks and soaks into the soil. And then we know that that stuff moves around. So sometimes it affects groundwater. Sometimes it flows around. And in a place like Landschaftspark in Germany, Gasworks Park in Seattle, they're decommissioned. And then now it's become popular to transform them into something else. And there are these kinds of 21st century urban ruins that people can go into. But plants, there are certain plants that actually filter a lot of pollutants out and either break them down or they absorb them. And then we have to, take them out, literally go burn them, and we have to replant them to try and get those pollutants out. And so post-industrial planting, or phytoremediation is the scientific term, really tackles cleaning things up after we're done with it in the industrial side of things.
I think, William, you and I have talked a lot about your love for trees. Yeah. And I'm curious, how do you pitch a tree? Like, of all the things in a city that need to be fixed or added, why is the tree something we should consider?
I think tree's the common ground. Everyone understands the benefit of like planting a tree. But I think what's also important is everyone has a very different affiliation or an association to a tree. It could be the tree that you had in your backyard that you climbed on all the time. It could be the tree that had a tire swing on it. It could be the one that changed into a bright red every fall that you always were super excited to see. Trees mean a lot to us. But we also have the scientific side, and we know that trees serve a lot of things for us. They operate for us as well. And so I don't think it's ever really hard to pitch a tree. I don't think it's hard to pitch planting trees. It is a feel good, and it's a press opportunity for a lot of politicians. I mean, I can't remember exactly how far back it goes, but most US presidents past, I think, 1900 have all planted a tree.
Even in the city scale in Boston, Mayor Wu also initiated the urban tree canopy movement to encourage people to plant more trees.
Exactly, and that goes beyond kind of the Arbor Day. Arbor Day really started tree planting in a lot of ways, but tree planting is seen as a universal good. And in Mayor Wu's case, it is a way of tackling urban heat. It's a way of cooling. It's a way of creating an urban canopy. It's a way of increasing biodiversity. And, there's all these kind of other things, but no one's going to complain about it. And in many ways, it's actually serving underserved populations is like, we need to plant over here. And it's really beneficial.
I know as an inhabitant of a city that trees aren't cheap either. And sometimes they are, there's sort of legislation or policy that requires you to keep trees. And a lot of times people are hesitant because they are expensive. So what goes into actually planting trees either at a local scale or at a mass scale?
A lot. And there's a lot that's never discussed. And so it is like getting the seeds, getting the space to make a sapling, which takes a couple of years to make a viable sapling. And then, so that's maintenance, that's soil, that's water, that's labor, a lot of labor. And then, for a lot of projects in a lot of cities, there's a certain caliber. So that's how wide the trunk is. And that is where cost is typically derived from. And so if it's a 2-inch caliber, it's a fairly narrow tree. Of course, it's going to be cheaper. It's younger. And then if you want a larger caliber, it only gets more and more expensive. And certain species grow faster than others. There are some that are aesthetically more pleasing. Oaks are popular. Certain areas have certain other trees that are deemed kind of more favorable than others. But there's that goes into it. So then you have to buy all of that. And then when you scale up, those are massive tree farms that you're having to purchase from. That then, on top of that, then you have to do the maintenance of it. Once you've planted them, you have to keep them alive. And so is there enough irrigation for that? Do you have to design the irrigation, or are you just hoping there's enough rain? Or, can you take on snowpack and kind of put snowpack on that to hopefully melt over time for the tree? But on top of that, there's fungus, there's insects, there's, biological invaders that could threaten the tree. So then you have to spray it with some type of chemical or something, which I don't think we all should be doing. But there's a lot of trying to keep that alive, and then finally you get it to a point where it's okay, and it can kind of go on its own. But that takes, at least 20, 30 years to get a tree like really going, and that is beyond a lot of people's general capacities of like, okay, what are we going to do here? It should, let's get this done now, versus a typical architecture construction project, which is just, a couple of years.
Right. So it obviously takes a lot of effort and time to have the tree rooted properly and also grow healthy for the neighborhood. Speaking of having a role that I sometimes have to agree to removing a tree, and tree being like you said, a common, it's perceived as a positive thing. And I also feel the same. However, there are criteria and more importance when there's more importance in providing more housing. There are circumstances that we will have to unfortunately move a tree or remove it. What's the best way, or any advice that you can give there? Because sometimes when I kind of propose to, can we ask the GC can we just move the tree to somewhere else? Mm-hmm. Like they would always come back and say like, oh, but they'll die and they won't grow, and these are like very tall trees. It's very difficult. It'll be costly, mm-hmm. so on and so forth. So I'm always struggling to find the best way to mitigate this situation. What's your recommendation?
That's tough. I'm someone who's clearly very pro tree, so I would say like you make your changes around these trees and we're going to keep these trees. I'm kind of like the Lorax in that regard. But I think there's a way of understanding, like, if there's a really beautiful mature tree that's providing a lot of shade and that, is solid in what it's doing, that's providing a huge service. So if it's in a housing project or even a mixed use development project, those serve as kind of these larger icons, essentially a specimen tree that does a lot of duty for you. It's an investment in that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's an argument to try and move trees if you need to. That can happen. Trees do live after being moved. You have to monitor it. You have to maintain it a little bit, but they do reacclimate. But if you do need to thin and if you do need to cut out, I think it's just important to be as delicate as possible to try and keep as much as you can. But I think it's worth working with whether it's an arborist or with the landscape architect who might be coming in, to evaluate which ones are maybe serving you the most aesthetic beauty, to really try and work around those. And some of them, if you're like the building is really going to come in and destroy that, see if you can move that. You might keep a couple there because they're already established and they're already, working and serving some capacity. So you might as well try and keep it. The toughest part is seeing massive land clearing that then they're going to put twigs that were grown in, a far-flung place, and then it's going to take forever for them to grow back. That's the hardest thing for me to see as a landscape architect.
Should we always plant native plants?
I'm going to be a little rebellious and say no. I think there's so many positives to planting a native species, so many positives, and I don't think those should ever be undermined in whichever way. But I think there's also a lot of introduced species that work well in the climate. They're not invasive to where they'll take over or they'll, radically change something. But I think it's important to also look at an expanded palette that can work and can work well, particularly with like water needs or growth rates, or even plants that certain species really take to keep that going as well. So I think we should definitely strive to use as many native species as possible, but let's definitely try and keep the introduced species palette there as well. But let's not put like water hyacinth and everything, or let's not plant kudzu, because it's only going to literally destroy like what you're doing.
Why is it so important for us to do this, right? Like we've talked a lot about how hard it is to fight nature. Like it has a mind of its own, right? We're doing all these things to control it, but it's going to do what it wants to do anyway. Like why is it so important for us to take all this effort to, move plants where they potentially don't want to be?
Because we haven't for 500 years. I mean, like I think that's the bluntest thing, is that we've tried to remake and recontrol for so long, and we've really cited on aesthetics for so long, and this looks beautiful, or this has been this exotic item that now I want to have over here is kind of this social status signifier. And so I think what we're now seeing is, one, some of these plants really don't work, or some of them take over, and we're seeing a lot of our collective results of things are not working the way that we do things right now. And so now we're having to repair, remake, replant, all of the re's or the d's in terms of our prefixes of what we're doing. But I think we're trying to right the wrongs that we've done for quite some time.
Is that where you see, I guess, the agency of, I guess, the current landscape practice is the re's and the d's?
Mhm. I think so. There's a lot that I think it's a lot of re's and d's, but I think it's also trying to figure out how do we work with. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of significant change that's happening that I think should be happening. And so with kind of the slow bureaucratic process that is the United States, I think a lot of landscape architects are trying to figure out how do we find the middle ground. And so how can we take what we got and how can we make that the best it can be, anticipating whether it's, denser populations or, industrial waste or whatever still going to be, coming in here, whatever it might be. We've got to work with what we got. And we are very well equipped. And there's a ton of options that we can use to tackle that. But, we got to make it work.
Well, in that regard, you follow up, Minko.
No, go ahead.
No, you follow up. My question, I think, is better for later.
Okay, yeah. In that regard, in an urban setting, no, actually, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask. Well, in that sense, what makes a good landscape architect?
Someone who's a mediator. I think typically the landscape architect has to be a mediator and has functioned as one for a long time. We bring the knowledge of ecology to the table, or horticulture to the table, with science and art and physics, and but also the developer and how is this going to get built, and the design of it all. And so I think a good landscape architect is one who can work between the lines and bring everything together. The landscape exists, especially in urban settings, as the in-between. And so we have to be able to bring it all together. We stitch it all together. We hear a lot about urban fabric. And we do that. We are the designers of that. And we have to keep that going.
Yeah, the Central Park and Highline being, I think, two of the most popular landscape projects in urban settings. As a developer and person who's dealing with private properties, what will be a best way to integrate more landscape into this? Like we talked about the vertical garden example before, but it also brings a lot of engineering issues. It's not the most sustainable way to build and integrate landscape more to buildings. What will be your recommendation?
I think it's letting the processes be. And so that would be opening up some impermeable paving to let water flow down, let water sink, using a stormwater design to where you might have planting that is actually going to help with runoff, to where flooding won't be an issue, where you can actually try and mitigate any type of flooding that might be happening in the development. Opening up space for light, but keeping it planted and vegetated to where then you're not having to worry about excess heat. You're actually working on passive cooling that might be happening as well. There's ways that just in really actually small spaces, if you use landscape materials, if you use plant materials or porous paving, whatever it might be, you can really effectively change the entire operation of the building envelope or the kind of cluster of buildings that you're doing.
I have a question that keeps on coming up. Let's say around the turn of the century, 2000 or so, we had what everyone sort of acknowledges as the Bilbao effect, that every city wanted to have a signature building, usually a cultural institution, a museum, an opera house, something like that would put them on the map. And then about 10 years later, the Highline comes out. And I think we're still in the moment of the Highline effect, where every single city wants to have its signature landscape, its signature public space. In San Francisco, I keep on hearing, oh, this is going to be our landscape, our Highline of San Francisco. And then there's another project that's going to be a Highline of San Francisco. Like, you can't have too many of them, first of all. But what it sort of brings to mind, and we talk often amongst the three of us about how things come about, how things can be incentivized, and what are the actual forces that shape the built environment. I don't think your argument that I think your argument that trees are unassailable is completely true. Like, you can't reject a tree. You want that space. As human beings, like when I see greenery, I lighten up, I feel happier, I feel healthier. But there is a fundamental issue, which is they don't produce revenue. And especially in a land-based economy, in cities that are expensive, it's hard to sometimes like incentivize making public spaces over private spaces. What's your response to that?
Well, so I would actually push back on that a little bit. I do think green space does produce revenue. At proximity to green space increases property value. Marketing kind of large civic infrastructure, that's recreation. That produces revenue. Events can happen on public space. That produces revenue. Concerts can happen. That produces revenue. You could even be having a business call on your walk in Central Park. That is producing revenue. And I know that gets a little meta, but I think the public realm does produce revenue. And investing in that is an investment in what happens. Like, sure, okay, your tenant is not going to be paying you rent or something like that. But I do think that what we do can also be seen as that. Now, there's a dark side to it called green gentrification, where if you build a brand new shiny park, then everyone's going to want to live in close proximity to it, which then, forces people out. Let's look at the Highline and the meatpacking district. But to that point, I think there have been 3 parks that have been major catalysts for landscape architecture in cities in North America and actually the world. And it is most definitely the Highline from field operations, Clyde Warren Park in Dallas from Office of James Burnett, which is a deck park over a highway. And then my third one would be Michael Van Valkenburg's Brooklyn Bridge Park in Brooklyn. And the 3 of those have really become these signifiers and these icons that many cities all over the world have wanted to invest in. So are we going to deck our highway? We can do that. Okay, we want a Highline. We want a Clyde Warren Park. Okay, we've got this kind of little trail system that we can do. We got to make a Highline. And then I would say that in the current time, Michael Van Valkenburg's office is the most sought after. Everyone wants a Brooklyn Bridge Park. And they've gone on to make Maggie Daley in Chicago. They've made some huge, massive parks across the entire United States. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, he's kind of like a modern Olmsted. He has a very kind of curvilinear form. They create these identities. They really pack in a lot of plants when they first open to where it looks fully grown. It looks fully vegetated. And he's good at what he does. His firm is good at what they do. And so I think
what would you say like makes these spaces successful? Like what makes the Highline, Brooklyn Bridge Park, like what sets them apart from other kind of urban parks and these projects?
Well, I think for the Highline, what set it apart is that it was so, in many ways, random. Like here's this elevated rail line that's been forgotten in this, funky part of Manhattan. And then what if we made it into a park? And it's kind of like, okay. And then you go out there, but you see it works because it's connecting so many different things. It's a spine that literally connects this larger skeletal system of the urban fabric there. For Clyde Warren Park, it's somewhat similar. It bridges a massive highway in Dallas, but it builds the entire downtown urban arts district together. And it made people want to actually be downtown in Dallas again. So you get kind of major urban but hotter city, and it's becoming, more popular to be downtown and be outside. And then Brooklyn Bridge Park, I think what really makes it work is, one, the views of Manhattan is one thing that I think is super attractive, but it's the amount of program. Soccer fields, there's trails, there's children's playgrounds, there's mounds, there's hills, and it feels like you're in this in-between zone where things have been sculpted to where it doesn't feel like you're in the middle of a city, but you're still working in the contours of a very urban environment. And so it shows that you can invest in the in-between zones. For a developer or for a city, it shows that we can do that, but look at the payoff. And like the amount of revenue that I'm sure HRA can figure out as like an advisor team, I'm sure the amount of revenue they can say that was produced in response to Brooklyn Bridge Park there's a lot of commas in that figure.
Do you see any influence of those like mega parks being created near water because of the need of more resilient design, more sustainable design, and things like that?
I think there's a lot that have been around water. There's so many parks that have been built around water. Whether that's South Point Park in Miami that Hargraves did, all the way up to Brooklyn Bridge Park in New York. Field operations just opened up a massive new waterfront for Seattle, I think just a couple weeks ago. And then we can look at any coastline as well. But there's also been a fairly significant investment in the interior. There's been a lot of river projects. There's Tom Lee Park in Tennessee that Escape opened with Jeannie Gang's office. There's a gathering place in Tulsa, which Michael Van Valkenburg did in Oklahoma. There's typically a water component, but there are some fairly large kind of non-water-based parks that have also been created, not necessarily to the same scale or to the same fanfare, but they do exist, and I mean they are being made.
I ask because it's usually when in an architecture design studio or design studio setting,
Mhm.
when we talk about resiliency and when we talk about the risk of water sea level rise, like our immediate reaction is just create a berm, like make landscape over there, like create a parking structure below and have it covered with green and parks. I get that because there are many popular and very well working examples, but are there any other ways, or how does landscape architecture view these type of projects, or are there any additional like discussions around these type of projects within academia or within practice too?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think landscape architecture, and sometimes, I'm not going to speak for everyone in my profession, but they architecture can be very heavy-handed, and like here's a parking deck with a tower with a, we're going to add a whole multi-use development around this, and it's just like, okay, like boom, you place some stuff on a site. We're in many ways a lot more delicate than that. We want to read the site, we want to read its contours, we want to read how things are working here, and we got to calibrate around that. That's what we want to do, is try and figure out how can we delicately place something and situate it in a way that better serves the entire kind of surrounding and environment here. And I think that there's a little bit more of a delicacy, but unfortunately that is counter to the efficiency of architecture and development. You'll want clean rectilinear buildings often, or kind of clean geometries that produce an efficient form of cost for the budget, but also what can be returned on that investment as well. And we are nebulous. Again, we're going to be softer. We're going to be a little bit more fluid, and that gets to be a little bit harder. But I would say, especially at the starting point for a lot of projects and a lot of the kind of kickoff meetings, or even before that, making the RFP for a project, I think it's good to understand maybe we do need to kind of take a step back and really read the land. So let's bring a landscape architect in earlier in the process to kind of then guide the urban design kind of form and the architecture form, and then we can kind of come in and keep that a conversation. I think we oftentimes come in way too late in a project.
So in order for me to think about involving landscape architects within the design process, I mean, and within the scale that I operate, I mean, I barely have a budget to work with a famous architecture firm. I certainly don't think I'll have a budget to work with a renowned landscape architecture firm. But what would be your recommendation? Like, I think when your approach sounds very sophisticated, is that any type of services that I can get in any type of landscape architecture firms?
I would say every landscape architect would be able to really read that work for you. And I will say, I know there's a lot of prestige landscape architecture firms, as there are with architecture firms. There's, especially post-COVID, there's been a proliferation of new firms that are not attached or tethered to coastal big American cities, but are all over the country and have really begun to kind of expand upon who we can call to, who have worked in these larger firms, who have experience in other places, but are more understanding of different types of cities and different types of spaces. And so I think that any landscape architecture firm will be able to help you with that. We're trained in that. We're, for licensure, we have to know those kinds of things. And so you don't have to have the big fancy person all the time. Sure, they're great to work with, or I hope they're great to work with. Again, can't speak for everybody. But there is a new wave and a new generation of firms that are coming up that are starting to really get those really interesting projects that are then gaining traction and beginning to counter kind of the hegemony of the typical kind of star architects or star landscape architects that we see.
Can you give us a few names that you know?
Yeah, Sarah Zodi's practice, I think, is one that has really launched itself, and she's really found a space that has worked really well in dealing with minority communities particularly, but she's done a lot of work in Pittsburgh. She's done a lot of work generally around the country. She's working on some stuff in Ohio right now, which will be really interesting. Merritt Chase is another firm where they have offices in Pittsburgh and in Indianapolis, and they're particularly focused and invested in the Rust Belt. which is a whole series of the United States that's experiencing a population change. Some of it's decline, some of it's increase. But again, those cities are now looking at other peer cities and they're reinvesting in that public realm. And so they're kind of taking that on in some really, really fascinating ways, which has been nice to see. Their studio Super Bloom in Denver, Colorado, which is really looking at the plains of Colorado and kind of these larger spaces. That they've worked with Studio Gang on the Oculus Hotel, which is the first, I believe, net zero or passive hotel in the country. And so they did the rooftop for that. But they're really working in kind of plant-focused projects that are getting to be really interesting as well. So they're really fascinating too, to where it's happening, in my opinion, really all over the country. And it's nice to see the smaller firms or kind of the now new mid-sized firms coming to maturity and seeing the work not just being done on these kind of coastal cities that get all of the attention all the time.
It's so interesting that there is also a new wave. I mean, of course there will be, but I'm thank you so much for giving me a rundown of the current landscape of landscape architecture. I think because of that, we spoke a lot about other people's work, which makes me very curious about your current work. Can you give us a brief of what you are doing, like your PhD dissertation?
Sure. In many ways, I've been inspired by the work that I've seen and experienced. And the crux of me coming into my PhD was that on the news, this was right before 2020, on the news that you could see all of these different things of like India planted 1 billion trees in a day, or Ethiopia planted 500 million trees in 6 hours. And you're like, okay, whoa. Or that you would be checking out on some, website and they're like, if you round up, we'll plant a tree and for your purchase. I was like, okay, well, there's all of these like massive projects out there that are wanting to plant trees. And I was like, where, who, why, what species, what age? I had all of these other questions. And I gave it a little bit of look. And then there was an initiative by Queen Elizabeth II called the Queen's Canopy, which was a Commonwealth-wide project for reforestation, afforestation projects to create a new Commonwealth-wide canopy in the name of Queen Elizabeth. And I read that as pretty neo-colonial. And again, I wanted to kind of dive into that. And I came into the program and quickly got into the context of the American landscape and how nature is so central to that. But I've always been taught the exact same story, that we started on the East Coast, we expanded to the West, and it feels like it ends when we get to California. And that is so not what the United States' history is. And so on top of that, I wanted to figure out, like, what is the role of, the forest in the United States? Like, what is the role of nature for us? And so I wanted to kind of warp that. And so I wanted to tell that story from the outside in. And I was, wrestling with former plantation spaces, looking at anything outside of our borders or the lower 48. And all of our territories, except for one, were former plantation spaces. So they were spaces of cultivation, and they're also all islands. And I landed in Hawaii, and I've been really interested in how the United States really pressured Hawaii to becoming a sugarcane powerhouse and a pineapple powerhouse. We overthrew their monarchy. It's the only monarchy we ever overthrew as Americans. But we've radically transformed Hawaii into being something kind of American that is still relegated as not quite American. And there's a ton that I can speak about this for 108,000 words is currently where I am on my dissertation. But it has been really fascinating. And I want to tell that story from the tree's perspective. Like, how did we get here by just examining the tree? And so I've looked at Ohia forests. It's the main tree I've looked into. It's the first species that can grow after a lava flow in Hawaii. So it's responsible for literally building the landscape of Hawaii, or the terrestrial landscape of Hawaii. And then attached with that, there's 3 other significant trees I've studied, which is sandalwood, which was erased due to the first ever Western style tax that King Kamehameha II enacted. And then I've also studied coconut trees, which have been really important, especially for the Hawaiian monarchy, but it's also a symbol of tourism. A lot of us want to go lounge underneath a palm tree. And then eucalyptus. So as sandalwood is erased, they imported a lot of eucalyptus from Australia and New Zealand to then get planted in Hawaii for capital return. And so I'm looking at kind of the machine that is the American landscape and how we all got here, which is really odd, to be completely honest with y'all. Really weird.
Well,
But
I
it's
always
been
thought
fun.
that it's first of all genius to pick Hawaii as your research area. It's not a bad place to
Everyone
go
says that.
to study, but it's also interesting that you bring up the fact that America it's an economic engine, and so much of it is driven through agriculture, logging, extraction, things of that nature, which have an immediate impact on our landscape. I mean, if you fly from the East Coast to the West Coast, and literally those so-called flyover states, a lot of them are just landscapes of production and
Yep.
consumption. And
Yep.
how important it is. I sort of retract my statement before. Like, yes, you don't necessarily get rent on that, but you do produce things out of that, and that fuels other stuff. I'm curious how Hawaii has played a role in that whole cycle of consumption, aside from pineapples and coconuts.
Yeah. So essentially, Hawaii became a sugar powerhouse after the Civil War, or during the Civil War, when the Louisiana sugar economy collapsed. And so Hawaii then kind of gets economically tethered to the United States in that regard. And that was an ongoing process, essentially. But the main thing that really happened after that, or after kind of the plantation era, is tourism. And so Hawaii, especially after World War II, although it starts kind of in the 1920s, but Hawaii is then seen as this kind of mystic wonderland. It's at the edge of the United States. It's the gateway to the Pacific. And there's all these awe about volcanoes and, the mystical Hawaiian woman that's there, that she's emerging out of nature. She's a flower. And it becomes this fantasy for a lot of people. And so as we overthrow the monarchy, we build two key hotels, the Royal Hawaiian Hotel and the Moana Surfrider Hotel, which are both still on Waikiki. And they're both now 5-star hotels. And those were places, frankly, for people to reenact kind of cultural immersion. And Hawaii is quickly then transformed into tourism dependency. Hawaii becomes dependent on the American or the domestic tourist who's trying to get promised the postcard of a landscape. So there's a color association, there's a way that it's supposed to look, it's supposed to be, I'm only supposed to experience this thing. And there's a ton of work in the representation of Hawaii that's making Hawaii look domesticated, that's making it look calm on the water. There's people swaying their hips in a hula performance or something like that. And so Hawaii then, before it becomes a state in the late 1950s, it becomes this kind of tourism playground that is so far away that you can kind of get away with anything over there. And it's this spoil from World War II because military tragedy happened out there with Pearl Harbor. That nowadays, it's really kind of choking under its performance. There's all of this expectation for Hawaii to be something. And you have to examine Hawaii. And every tourist who's flying in there, because so much of the tourism is still flight-based, there's kind of this like immediate shock that it's supposed to be this emerald set of islands with tropical cocktails and flowers abound everywhere. And that's not the reality, especially of Oahu, where Honolulu is. And so I think the tough part for Hawaii right now is figuring out how to maintain itself. And there's active forms of resistance for that, which has been really exciting to see.
The other thing that happened in Hawaii recently is the wildfires in Maui, which brings to someone's attention that natural landscapes, although they have their own laws and they kind of are generally in balance, increasingly it seems, or at least we're noticing more and more imbalance, or at least the effect of either human effects on the earth, or be it climate change or sort of increased inclement weather. I don't know how to say it more sensitively, but how does landscape architecture, and maybe in your work, how do you accommodate for the potential that what was a system for a long, long time is suddenly changing?
We were actually just having this conversation earlier today with a few of my colleagues. We have to adapt, and there's a lot of struggle there's a lot of input we get in that we want things to return to something, or we want to keep this the way that it is. And I think that's a very valid, and it's necessary to consider what can we keep. But particularly, we have to look at what's to come. We know that things are really not going to radically change anytime soon, unfortunately. And so we have to take with that, okay, there's going to be some sacrifices that are here, and it's going to be messy, and it's not going to be easy. But landscape architects can begin to try and replant reshape the land to where fires might be deterred in terms of how we might design fire breaks or something like that. We can also try and propagate and plant more native species to maintain that natural identity of something. Or if there's going to be places that are going to be getting wetter, designed for better stormwater management. Or if places are going to have worse air pollution, we can design for plants that can literally filter that, or in Scape's case, filter the water with 5 valves. We have, again, the tools to adapt and meet the needs, and we're ready to do that. Every landscape architect is ready to do that. The tough part is figuring out how to work within what can we keep, what's going to be brought forward, and how can we hopefully, maintain some of those narratives. But it's tough work, and especially in Hawaii and some other places, it's really, really hard to make the meaningful kind of impact we need to.
Sorry, why is it hard in Hawaii in particular? Like, what's different about there versus other places in the United States?
Hawaii's contained. There's a lot of issues with property ownership that really stems from the plantation economy. But a lot of Hawaii is owned by people who don't live there year round. It's owned by a lot of people who have a lot more means and resources than those who live there. And so it's hard for people to make a big change, especially to private property. And then Hawaii is still seen as this kind of tourism paradise. And so in the event of Maui, the fires in Maui, immediately developers were calling property owners being like, can I buy your land from you? Because they know that they can transform it into something and make so much money off of that investment, which is fair. If you want to make money, I mean, that's a way to make money, but there's a way to be delicate about it. And there's a way to kind of observe and be fair that, like, a lot of people lost their homes and a lot of people literally can't afford to live in Hawaii. I mean, the cost of living in Hawaii is extreme. And so I think that's kind of the wrestling match that's currently occurring.
Well, then what would you recommend in that case? What types of interventions or what types of lenses should we be looking at places like Hawaii or other vulnerable conditions around the world?
There's a lot of places that I think are forgotten about. And there's a lot of places that seem far away for a lot of people. And whether that's through flooding, through fire, through whatever natural disaster, or even just through poverty or whatever it might be, I think we need to really systematically address how to keep this world livable for everyone. I'm not even going to say most people, but really for everyone. And that takes radical change. And our profession has had radical change before. In the United States, Frederick Law Olmsted was the one to advocate for us as landscape architects to design national parks and design forests. He designed the Biltmore Forest. He designed Yellowstone, or he drew the schematics for what Yosemite would be. He helped create the idea of a national park. And I think now in the 21st century, we're seeing landscape architecture grow again to understanding kind of the national scale of building a project. And it is interconnected and it's piecemeal, but it all comes together as such. And I think we're seeing kind of these larger infrastructural moves that are more carefully studied, whether that's through grants from the Army Corps or through kind of larger government projects. But we're seeing landscape architects enter into that form of kind of a new field boundary that I think is necessary and critical to kind of working at the largest scale, which is like a national scale. How do we build the American landscape? How do we maintain the American landscape? And we're doing it. But I think that's where you'll see, and I'm excited to see landscape architecture go moving forward.
No, I think it's incredible that you have this, in the case of North America, you just have an incredible large palette, right? There's probably, you might be able to look at the entire continent as a place for opportunity, or in your case, introspection or research. I'm a huge fan of landscape architecture. It's something that I find as an architect extremely hard to get into. I don't have the one, I don't have a green thumb. I can just grow bamboo basically. But I also, it's not something that I'm particularly accustomed to or good at designing around, but I think it's something that I know once you add good landscape to any project of any scale, it just changes the whole complexion of the outcome. And it's, I think, something that I'm discovering more and more in urbanism, in architecture, even in development, is becoming more and more on people's minds.
Well, and and to that, it's becoming a lot more popular around the world. So, landscape architecture was kind of born, so to speak, in North America and the United States, but recently, Kachakor and Boracombe, a land process in Bangkok, Thailand, has radically shaped the attention that Bangkok is receiving for its urban realm, with the Chulalongkorn Centenary Center and the green roof that has also been built. It's the largest urban green roof in Thailand, or I believe in Asia. Turinscape with Kong Jianyu in China has also done some radical work as well. There's a lot of work from Mass Design Group in Southern Africa that's also being done. And then Europe also has a fair amount of traditions in that. Burle Marx's office is still operating in South America. There's been a big expansion of landscape architecture in South America. And Australia is also doing quite a bit as well. So, I mean, it's nice to see that it's not just this like American space of opportunity, but it is something that landscape architecture is now being recognized as a truly viable, but also like an approachable medium that can actually start to fix these things and make the meaningful change that we need to make.
I'm curious, where do you see yourself in this new era of landscape architecture?
I don't see myself necessarily practicing. I do like practice, but I want to stay in the academy and I want to keep figuring out the questions of how we got here, but coming up with pathways forward, and helping to not only kind of educate in terms of students to have them a little bit more sensitive into the moves they're making and what it means to build, because building truly has impact, and I think that's hard to teach, but I think it's a good thing to teach, and I hope to also begin to try and shape a larger dialogue, no matter where I am and how all of us have an association with nature. All of us typically like nature. All of us want to have some type of relationship to that. And how do we foster that type of engagement at whatever type of scale?
William, I think it's always a pleasure to talk to you because you're very strong and adept at connecting the dots. You see the big picture, but you also, as you mentioned through all your precedents and all the people that you acknowledged, are talking about how individual work can form a much larger collective effort towards something. And I think, like you say, the maintenance and the, I guess, elevation and sort of creation of our natural environment is extremely important. It's not something that we can cut corners on at all. But I want to end on our final question, which is always, which era are we in right now?
Chaos. I say chaos because I think there's a lot going on. And I think there's a lot of different directions that are going on. Some bad, some good. But I think we're in a moment of redefinition, and that is chaotic. And I think that we got to figure things out. But I think it's okay to not have it really figured out.
Well, wonderful. It's always a pleasure, William. Thank you for this conversation. I think I'll always enjoy talking to you about trees.
We can have any conversation any day about a tree.
But it's also always a pleasure to talk to you about things like how landscape connects to other elements. And I've always appreciated that about you. Wish you the best, and we'll love to keep up with your research as it starts to be produced.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on here. Great questions. Yeah, look forward to seeing you all soon.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. Most modern 팟캐스트.